Thank you for joining us for the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance's third forum on the Greek genocide during the late Ottoman period. My name is Luke Katsos, EMBCA's president, and I will be moderating today's panel. Our distinguished panel includes Hellenic, Australian historian and philosopher, Themistocles Kritikakos, PhD at the University of Melbourne, author Dr. Fatima Mouj Gocek, professor of sociology at the University of Michigan, author Dr. Vassilios Meichanetsidis, postdoctoral researcher, teaching assistant, National University of Athens, author-writer Lou Ureneck, professor of journalism, retired at Boston University, author Dr. Theodosios Kyriakidis, research fellow at the chair for Pontic studies at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and author-engineer Savvas Koktzoglou. The Greek genocide, which occurred between 1913 and 1923, was a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing, mass killing, and forced deportations targeting the indigenous Hellenic population of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the eastern Thrace, Pontos, and western Anatolia. This atrocity was part of a broader series of genocidal policies aimed at eliminating Christian communities, including Armenians and Assyrians, as the Ottoman Empire sought to create a homogeneous Turkish Muslim state. The genocide, carried out first by the Committee of Union and Progress and later by national forces, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Greeks as well as other Christians, and the destruction of the ancient Hellenic communities in Asia Minor. The Hellenic presence in Asia Minor and Eastern Thrace dates back over 3,000 years, with cities like Smyrna, Ephesus, Trapezunda serving as major centers of Hellenic culture and commerce. Despite centuries of Ottoman rule, these communities maintained a Hellenic identity, in most cases language and traditions. However, in the late 18th century and early 20th centuries, the weakening Ottoman Empire became increasingly nationalistic, and Christian minorities were viewed as internal enemies. Tensions escalated following the Balkan Wars between 1912 and 13, in which Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria defeated the Ottoman Empire and expelled Muslims from the Balkans. In retaliation, the Ottoman government targeted Greeks in Eastern Thrace and Western Anatolia, forcing many into exile, marking the beginning of the systematic persecution. The outbreak of World War I, 1914-1918, provided the Ottoman leadership with an opportunity to escalate their policies of extermination under the guise of wartime security measures. The first wave of the genocide began under CUP government, particularly under the leadership of Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Cemal Pasha. Ottoman authorities and irregular paramilitary groups, such as the Special Organization, targeted Greek villages along the Aegean coast, Eastern Thrace, and Pontos. One of the most brutal campaigns occurred in Pontos, where tens of thousands of Greeks were massacred between 1916 and 1918, and entire villages were burned to the ground. This policy saw the deportation of thousands of Greek Orthodox clergy and intellectuals, aiming to erase the Hellenic identity. Following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I and the terms of the Treaty of Savvas, Greece was granted control over Smyrna and surrounding areas, angering Turkish nationalists. In response, Mustafa Kemal national forces led a military campaign to drive out both the Greek army and the local Greek populations. The Greek genocide resulted in the deaths of approximately 1.2 million Greeks and the displacement of over 1.5 million. The destruction of ancient Greek communities in Anatolia severed thousands of years of Greek cultural and historical presence in the region. Survivors fled to Greece, the United States, and other Western countries, where they faced extreme hardship and discrimination. The genocide also had a lasting impact on Greek-Turkish relations, creating a deep-rooted historical trauma. Greece absorbing a massive influx of refugees, reshaped the demographics and the economy. The loss of Greek communities in Asia Minor was not just a human tragedy, but also a cultural catastrophe, as countless historical sites, churches, and manuscripts were destroyed. Despite overwhelming historical evidence, Turkey has never officially recognized the Greek genocide. Indeed, it continues to deny or justify the mass killings as a consequence of war, rather than a deliberate campaign of extermination. This denial has been widely criticized by historians and human rights organizations. However, the efforts to recognize the Greek genocide have gained traction in recent years. Greece, Cyprus, and various international organizations have formally acknowledged the atrocities. In 1994, the Greek parliament declared May 19th as the official Remembrance Day for the Pontian Greek genocide, which is tomorrow. Okay, the recognition is tomorrow. And part of the reason why we're having this particular event today. And in 1998, September 14th was designated to commemorate the broader genocide of Anatolian Greeks. The Greek genocide remains one of the most tragic and overlooked episodes in early 20th century. The systematic extermination of Greeks in Anatolia was part of a larger policy of ethnic cleansing, and which also targeted, of course, as we mentioned earlier, Armenians and Assyrians, reshaping the demographics of the region. The destruction of Greek communities in the late Ottoman period marked the end of Hellenic civilization in Asia Minor, a land Greeks had inhabited for millennia. Recognizing and studying this genocide is not only important for historical justice, but also for preserving future atrocities. The memory of the victims must be preserved and the historical truth acknowledged, and to ensure that such crimes are never repeated. So thank you all for being with us, as I indicated. And what I'd like to do is start with our first presenter, our first panelist. It's Dr. Themistocles Kritikakos. He is a Hellenic Australian historian and philosopher. His research focuses on intergenerational trauma, memory, identity, and genocide recognition within the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian communities in Australia. He completed his PhD in history at the University of Melbourne, examining these themes. Dr. Kritikakos has worked as a teaching associate at the University of Melbourne and research assistant at the Australian Catholic University. A regular contributor to Greek Australian media, community forums, and international academic conferences, he is currently in the process of publishing his first book on the legacies of the violence during the late Ottoman Empire within the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian diasporas in Australia. Welcome, Themistocles, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Lou. Thanks for having me. I also would like to say thank you to Savvas for extending the invitation to me, and the organisers for bringing us together for this important discussion and day of commemoration. And it's a privilege to contribute alongside many distinguished scholars and researchers. So my presentation will explore the transition from imperial imperialism to ethnic nationalism in the late Ottoman Empire, focusing on the systematic eradication of Christian minorities, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians. What I'll argue is that genocide arose through interconnected phases of state-led persecution involving successive regimes, demographic engineering, ideological radicalization, and cumulative violence. The campaign against Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, particularly between 1914 and 1923, beginning with the persecution of Greeks in Eastern Thrace and Western Anatolia, alongside Assyrians in Eastern Anatolia, followed by the Armenian Genocide in 1915, the 1916 persecution of Pontic Greeks, and the continued violence during the Greco-Turkish War, including the 1921-22 atrocities in Pontos and the catastrophe of Smyrna in 1922. Should be understood as part of a broader process of persecution spanning from the late 19th century to the population exchange. This presentation traces how successive Ottoman and Turkish regimes, despite changes in leadership, consistently targeted Christian minorities as existential threats through dispossession, deportation, extermination. And these actions, though shaped by shifting nationalist ideologies and even internal political differences, they were driven by a shared aim of exclusion and national homogenization. So, drawing on Tana Akcham's important work, the concept of genocide as a process challenges event-based interpretations by presenting it as an evolving phenomenon. So, the process is characterized by ideological shifts, administrative planning, the systematic erosion of minority rights, often preceded by mechanisms of exclusion, such as demographic and territorial reorganization, illegal discrimination, surveillance, propaganda, economic boycotts, and bureaucratic marginalization. So the notion of cumulative radicalization and the transformation of state objectives aligns with concepts such as that of Dirk Moses, the problem of permanent security, for instance, wherein the perpetrator views minority groups as inassimilable threats to national cohesion. The presence of Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, who in some instances advocated for reform or autonomy, it was perceived to be incompatible with the survival of the empire and the subsequent establishment of the Turkish nation state. So the Ottoman Empire had long governed its diverse population through the millet system, which granted religious minorities limited autonomy, though they were considered second-class citizens technically. Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians had deep historical roots in Anatolia and Eastern Thrace, as we know. They were an integral part of the empire's cultural and economic life. However, from the 19th century onward, significant political changes took place. The Tanzimat reforms between 1839 and 1876 aimed to modernize the state and grant equal citizenship to non-Muslims, but instead provoked conservative backlash and failed to resolve minority grievances. Following the Russian-Ottoman War, the 1878 Treaty of Berlin, which redrew Balkan borders, but also called for Armenian reforms, heightened suspicion and paranoia that Christians were aligned with foreign powers. Under Sultan Abdulhamid II between 1876 and 1909, the empire turned increasingly authoritarian, culminating in the Hamidian massacres of 200,000 Armenians and 20,000 Assyrians between 1894 and 1896. The 1908 Young Turk Revolution briefly raised hopes for civic equality. The Committee of Union and Progress, the political organization of the Young Turks, soon centralized power and promoted a vision of unified Ottoman nationalism. However, at CUP congresses in 1910 and 1911, leaders explicitly discussed using force to impose Ottomanization, arguing that it could never be achieved by persuasion but required the force of arms. And prominent Young Turks, for instance, Dr. Bahedin Shakir, for instance, likened Christian minorities to foreign and harmful weeds that need to be uprooted. The Balkan Wars between 1912 and 1913, which brought significant territorial losses for the Ottoman Empire and a Muslim refugee crisis from the Balkans, radicalized the regime. Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, were increasingly viewed as internal enemies, and this accelerated Turkification through land seizures, expulsions, and resettlement of Muslims from the Balkans in Christian majority areas. During the First World War, genocidal policies were carried out against Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, which continued until the Greco-Turkish War of 1919-1922, resulting in the deaths and displacement of up to 3 million people between 1914 and 1923. This violence was orchestrated by central and local Ottoman authorities, military forces, paramilitaries, local collaborators, including some members of Kurdish and Arab tribes. Although these groups were the primary targets, other minorities, including Maronites, Antiochian Greeks of the Levant, Yazidis, Kurds, and Jews also suffered various forms of persecution. And that's something that will need to be researched further. The post-war Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Savvas sought to redraw territorial boundaries and hold Ottoman leaders accountable. However, these efforts were soon undermined by shifting political dynamics. Similarly, the Istanbul trials between 1919 and 1920, which aimed to prosecute Ottoman officials for wartime atrocities against Christian subjects, collapsed, especially due to lack of a legal framework, sustained international enforcement as well, which resulted in impunity for the perpetrators. In May 1919, Greek forces backed by the Allies occupied Smyrna, an event welcomed by many local Greeks. At the time, the Megali there, the idea of a greater Greece, had gained momentum. Meanwhile, Mustafa Kemal launched a Turkish nationalist movement from Samsun'da and Pontos, marking the beginning of the Greco-Turkish War on May 1919. So Christian persecution continued under the Turkish nationalist movement, or the Kemalists, whose vision of a unified Turkish nation state led to the displacement and erasure of non-Turkish communities. The destruction of Smyrna in September 1922, including the Armenian Greek and the Greek quarters of the city, and the deaths of up to 100,000 Christian civilians, predominantly Greek, marked the culmination of these campaigns. Though ideologically distinct, both the Young Turks and the Kemalists pursued demographic engineering to achieve ethnic uniformity and political consolidation. While the Kemalists rejected the Young Turks' imperial ideology, they advanced similar objectives under the guise of building a modern nation state. The 1923 Treaty of Lausanne formalized new borders, and the subsequent population exchange cemented the exclusion and marginalization of Christian minorities from the Turkish Republic. I'd like to briefly touch on the connection to Australia. So examining the transition from the late Ottoman Empire to the early Turkish Republic shows how nationalism and the drive for permanent security and ethnic homogenization shaped the systematic targeting of Christian minorities. And a key aspect of this is the targeting of communities or minority communities in areas central to First World War military operations, such as the Gallipoli Peninsula and Eastern Thrace. 2 weeks prior to the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, landing on Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915, over 30,000 Greeks of Gallipoli were deported, and none remained after the First World War. This coincided with the beginning of the Armenian Genocide, the mass arrest and deportation of Armenian intellectuals in Constantinople on the 24th of April, just a day earlier. These actions reflected a coordinated strategy by the Young Turk regime to eliminate those seen as internal enemies, revealing how military planning and nationalist ideology were deeply intertwined. Contemporary commemorations, particularly in Australia, often frame the Gallipoli campaign as the birth of the nation. However, this is also reinforced by the reconciliation between two former adversaries, namely Australia and Turkey. And there are annual commemorations in Gallipoli. The events represented obviously as a national victory for Turkey during the First World War. There's an emphasis on shared sacrifice within this narrative, which has fostered mutual respect, epitomized by the widely cited, though historically contested, words of reconciliation to the mothers of the Anzacs attributed to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. However, this reconciliation narrative marks a more complex history. Anzac prisoners of war witnessed the persecution of Christians, and Australian media reported on these atrocities. Australian humanitarians supported relief efforts from 1915 to 1930, providing aid to survivors and helping to resettle refugees in Greece and the Middle East, in countries such as Lebanon and Syria. Notably, in 1918, Anzac officer Sir Stanley Savage, during Operation Dunsterforce in northwest Persia, helped rescue over 50,000 Assyrian refugees. And George Treloar, Australian Commissioner for Refugees, later facilitated the resettlement of up to 100,000 Christian refugees in northern Greece following the population exchange. Gallipoli's prominence in Turkish cultural memory is closely intertwined with narratives of national glory, which also draw on the victory in the Greco-Turkish War. Turkish cultural memory has been shaped by the narratives of national triumph over internal enemies and foreign invaders, while silencing minority histories and systematically erasing their suffering. Atrocity is often framed as unfortunate but necessary for the preservation of a national unity or as inevitable outcomes of wartime conditions. In Australia, efforts towards historical recognition and justice have emerged, with members of the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian communities collaborating to confront their shared trauma. The recognition campaigns have achieved joint recognition at the state level on 3 occasions in South Australia, New South Wales, and Tasmania. And there's a broader goal of securing national recognition and being included in the national narratives of Australia. Situating the genocides of the Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians within a broader framework of the targeted violence enables a more comprehensive and historically nuanced understanding, while recognizing the distinct experiences of each group. This approach highlights their interconnected persecution under successive Ottoman Turkish regimes. The 3 communities were targeted for their perceived incompatibility with the vision of a unified empire or Turkish nation state. And the Christian population of the Ottoman Empire, which made up 25 to 30% in 1914, has declined to less than 1% in modern Turkey. Exclusionary nationalism has frequently served as an ideological framework for mass violence by casting minorities as existential threats to the nation's cohesion. And through dehumanization, and delegitimization, such narratives create the conditions under which ethnic cleansing and genocide is rationalized as necessary to preserve or restore the state's integrity. So Ottoman Turkish nationalism, which is rooted in ethnic and religious exclusivity, defined the final years of the Ottoman Empire and shaped the emerging Turkish Republic. It framed Christian minorities as threats to national unity and deemed them unassimilable within the broader project of monocultural homogenization. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. When we ask for recognition, let's say in Australia, what does that mean? What does that really mean, in your opinion?
So I think it's recognizing that Australians responded to the plight of Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians that provided humanitarian aid. There were eyewitness accounts that they should be included in the national narratives of Australia, because currently at the national level, they're pretty much omitted. The Australian government does not recognize, the federal government does not recognize that there was a genocide, and this is due to the shared history with Turkey that surrounds Gallipoli and that narrative and how that's played out in Australia the past few years, and the commemoration of the Gallipoli campaign. It's one that's shared with Turkey. There's annual commemorations in Gallipoli in Turkey each year. And I think for survivors living in Australia as citizens, Australian citizens, the descendants of survivors, they will feel like this heals wounds and potentially could put some pressure on Turkey. But even if that was not the case, that they could achieve recognition from Turkey at this point in time, having Australia's backing as Australian citizens, as descendants of genocide survivors, Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians, this would mean a lot in terms of healing wounds. And I've worked a lot on intergenerational trauma, conducted over 70 interviews with members or descendants of survivors from the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian communities in Australia. And you see how there's different layers to the activism. There's the personal dimension, there's the more so collective dimension where it relates to justice, historical justice, and that's what recognition means to them, as something that is deeply connected to justice, a form of justice at the very least.
Thank you so much, Themistocles, and we'll get back to that issue a little bit later. Our next presenter is Lou Ureneck. He's the author of Smyrna, September 1922, the definitive account of the destruction of Smyrna and the maritime rescue of hundreds of thousands of Greek and Armenian refugees. He is a retired professor at Boston University, where he chaired the journalism department. He was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and served as its editor in residence. He has won numerous awards for his work, and he has also appeared on many of the panel discussions that EMBCA has had in the past on a yearly basis in September, where we discuss in particular the burning of Smyrna. Thank you, Lou, for being with us today and sharing some of your thoughts on this particular topic.
Thank you for the invitation, Lou, and I salute you and the others, but in particular you for putting this panel together. And I continue to admire the energy and scholarship that you personally bring to this subject. I appreciate it. Many other people appreciate it as well. I'm going to focus my remarks largely on Smyrna, which was the subject of my research and the subject that I wrote about in Smyrna, September 1922. I'm going to edit my remarks a little bit to avoid duplication of your overview, as well as some of the important points that Themistocles made as well. But let me begin with Smyrna. Smyrna is especially interesting, I think, because it's both an emblem of the genocide and the culmination of the genocide that swept Asia Minor in those years. So first, it's important to have a reminder of the suffering that occurred at Smyrna, beginning on the 9th of September, 1922, and ending with the evacuation of the city at the end of the same month. As you recall, the Turkish army entered Smyrna on the 19th of September, a cavalry regiment coming in along the quay. And then on the 13th of September, the Armenian army set fire to the city, to the back section of the Armenian quarter, when a particularly nasty wind was blowing out of the southeast and drove the fire over most of the city of Smyrna. The fire lasted for 3.5 days. And during that time, there was not only the 200,000, actually more than 200,000 residents of the city in the city, but also hundreds of thousands of refugees, both Greeks and Armenians, who had fled the interior of Anatolia, fearful of their fate at the hands of the Turkish army. And so they packed the city. They were sleeping on sidewalks and in graveyards and in churchyards and wherever they could find a place to put down a blanket and set down the few household goods that they could bring with them into the city of Smyrna. They were fully exposed to the violence that was ultimately to follow. So the city was packed with people at the time of the Turkish army's entry into the city and at the time of its immolation. And so pausing for just a moment, many people who are familiar with this subject know what's special about the city of Smyrna, but for those who are new to this subject, let me just say quickly that Smyrna was a very special city inside the Ottoman Empire. In fact, it was a very special city in the entire Mediterranean rim. It was one of the wealthiest cities, perhaps the wealthiest city on the Eastern Mediterranean rim. It was a multicultural city, many different ethnicities, religions, languages, and so forth. And it was a cultivated city. It was unusual in its cultivation. It was a city that had theaters, an opera house, yacht clubs, the first golf club course in the Near East. It had 475 coffee houses, as you might expect for a Greek majority city. There were dozens of newspapers, publishing houses. There was a French department store. The skirts that the women wore in Smyrna were shorter than other parts of the Mediterranean. The men wore jaunty straw hats. It was a very special, livable, and mostly tolerant city. There had been episodes in the past where there were ethnic conflicts and so forth, but nothing like the rest of the empire. Having said that, let me get back to the story. After the Turkish army entered the city, first the cavalry and then the foot soldiers, there was a widespread killing and rape of Christian residents by both the Turkish army and Turkish civilians, neighbors on neighbors. People were shot in the street, they were sabred, they were beheaded, women were dragged from their homes, they were raped in front of their families, and then decapitated. It was a scene beyond any horrible imagining. Their homes were ransacked. And what was occurring at the time what was occurring at the time was something not unlike a medieval army being out of control and looting a conquered city. So as I say, the army, and there are many witnesses to this fact, even though there are those who would like to dispute it, including American witnesses, American military witnesses, sailors from a number of the American destroyers that were present in the city, saw the Turkish army light the fire. The fire first drove across the Armenian section and then generally across the entire city, driving the Greeks and Armenians from their homes and the refugees, importantly, from their hiding places. And they had nowhere to go except toward the sea and away from the fire. And they ended up on the so-called quay, the promenade that traced the waterfront edge of the city. And there, many tens of thousands of people died from fire, literally burning alive. There's British testimony of Turkish soldiers pouring gasoline down, kerosene down the streets, which led, downhill to the quay, and then lighting the kerosene and catching people on fire. There were drownings, some of which were suicides. People were so overcome with what was going on, losing their children, women wetting their dresses, trying to keep their children from literally roasting alive. There was suffocation. There were so many people on the quay that they were pressed together. We're talking about a quay that was maybe let's say 30 or 40 feet wide and a mile long. And you've got many hundreds of thousands of people there with their animals, horses and goats and so forth. And the animals, of course, panicked with the fire that was right there, right behind them in the city. The animals panicked, and people were also killed in animal stampedes and human stampedes. The analogy that I use in my book to describe the scene is it's not unlike what we sometimes see in these natural history, unfortunately, documentaries, where there's a forest fire and the fire is ripping at rapid speed through the trees, through the treetops and below, pushing the animals in a direction out of the forest. Of course, the residents of Smyrna were not animals, but it gives you a picture, of the kind of terror and suffering that occurred on the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th in Smyrna as that fire swept through the city. The fire eventually extinguished itself. I mean, it just literally burned out. And following the fire, those who survived, they suffered from thirst. The pipes that carried water into the city were fully destroyed, melted in many cases. They suffered from starvation and disease. You can just imagine there are no sanitary facilities along this narrow quay, and there are hundreds of thousands of people. And then, and especially at night, this is the case, there continued to be executions by the Turkish army of the Christian residents, Greeks and Armenians, along the quay, and rapes where soldiers would come in on horseback, pick out the girls that they like and take them back into the city, rape them and kill them. Just horrible beyond imagining. It's worth noting that the Western powers, the Americans, the British, the Italians, the French were all present with their navies at Smyrna Harbor as this was going on. In fact, it's one of the reasons so many refugees had fled to Smyrna. They believed that with all of that Western power amassed in the city's harbor, that they would be safe. And of course, they were wrong. The Western power, the navies who were there, they did nothing. There was let's call it a minor evacuation that occurred on the night of the 13th and the morning of the 14th on the part of the British, in which they launched their so-called whale boats ashore and brought some people And this was triggered largely by junior officers in the British Navy who were appalled what they saw, and they begged their commanding officer to allow them to launch boats to save some of the people. But very few were saved. Some of those who were put on American and British vessels and carried to Greece. It's also worth noting that, and by the way, I should say that the incident is too mild a word. The catastrophe that was occurring was viewed by the Western powers as largely an internal matter. The Turkish nationalists or the emerging Turkish government dealing with people who were residents of Turkey or the Ottoman Empire. They were not necessarily Greek citizens and so forth. They were residents, though not fully citizens of the Ottoman Empire. And it's also worth noting that the evacuation that ultimately occurred, and the evacuation that did occur, really was just of women and children. The men who were taken out of line as the evacuation began late in the month and put into cages, often marched, either shot right there on the waterfront or marched into the interior where they were put onto work crews that often led to their deaths, or they were simply evacuated and shot in the interior. Again, horrible beyond imagining. The evacuation was organized by two Americans, a minister and a naval lieutenant, an American minister and an American naval lieutenant, both of whom were really operating outside of the parameters of their authority. The American minister was kind of overstating his authority in terms of his relationship with the Near East Relief and others. And the naval lieutenant was working around a very brutal, difficult, and I would even say racist American representative in Constantinople by the name of Bristol, Admiral Bristol. And then, of course, there was the third person involved in this rather miraculous evacuation, a Greek ship commander, Theophanidis, on the island of Lesbos. So as awful as this all is, it's all it's documented. The American ship commanders went ashore. There were five ships, I think, at one point, American ships. All the commanders went ashore, took notes, made very thorough and documented reports, as well as the British did the same, and likewise with the French. So all of this suffering is not mythology. It's not rumor. It's not sort of history handed down orally from one generation to the next with exaggeration. It's authoritative and neutral history, well documented. It was a humanitarian disaster, unlike, or I should say, rarely seen in history. And of course, the world stood by while this was occurring, which is perhaps another topic for discussion at some other time. But so why do I see Smyrna as a symbol or sort of a microcosm of the larger genocide? Well, Smyrna was a Greek city, and by that I mean it was a Greek majority city in terms of counting people. But there were other Christians. There was a very significant Armenian presence. It was much smaller in terms of numbers than the Greek presence, but there were many, about 15,000 or more Armenians who lived there. And many of those Armenians were among the most successful people in the city. They had very successful businesses and exporting carpets, tobacco, fruit, and various other things. And there were very important Armenian institutions located at Smyrna, both book publishing houses, churches, and newspapers. So it was a Greek city, but it had other Christians living there. So when we speak of the Greek genocide, what really, others have touched on this, and I think we'll continue to touch on it. We're speaking of one aspect, really, of a Christian genocide that reached its apex, its violent apex at Smyrna. I see the genocide that occurred less as an ethnic genocide and more as a religious genocide or a religious cleansing of the Greeks, the Armenians, and the Assyrians of Anatolia, and the eastward parts of the empire, all the way into Mesopotamia, which is where the Assyrians were largely situated. And I think it's worth noting that this was documented. These activities, these genocidal type activities, were documented as far back as 1896, when the Prime Minister Gladstone of Great Britain made speeches and spoke of this very forcefully and articulately. So, of course, we know that there were Greeks all through Asia Minor. Asia Minor may have had a population its population may have been 25% Christian before 1922, or at least before 1915, let's say that. But the Greeks were especially in Ionia, Pontos, and Cappadocia, the Assyrians in Mesopotamia, and the Armenians were well distributed throughout Asia Minor, but especially in the northeast, in their ancient homeland, where they had been Christian residents for many, many centuries. And as the Armenians often remind us, they were perhaps the first organized Christian church. And again, it's worth noting, just in terms of documentation, that the killings of the Assyrians as well as the Greeks and the Armenians are very well documented. I cite the Bryce report, the British report of 1915, and so forth, which gets into this in great detail. So what happened in the late 19th and early 20th century was essentially a holy war. It was a holy war, a jihad, waged by the Sultan and then later by the Turkish nationalists, often through their agents, the Kurds, as an attempt to Islamicize Asia Minor, to somehow save and, quote, purify the empire. And I think it's significant in looking especially at Smyrna, that once the Turkish army entered the city of Smyrna, the violence was first visited on the Armenian border. And it seemed as though the animus of this poorly paid peasant army, first focus on the Armenians, and that's where the killing and the nightmare began. And I think we have to remember that this was a ragtag peasant army that had been propagandized for many years to hate Greeks and Armenians as both infidels, non-Muslims, as well as conspirators against Turkey, against the Ottoman Empire, an empire that was in decline and suffering paranoia and other pathologies. So in my view, the violence at Smyrna was both the culmination and, in a way, the perfection of the holy war, the jihad that had been going on for at least 2, maybe 3 decades. It's ironical in a sense, because when we think of the history of the Christian church, we know that the early church was really formed in that part of the world. We think of the churches at Ephesus and Smyrna and Philadelphia and Constantinople and so forth. The Christian church as a church had its formation in this part of the world. And of course, it's where St. Paul walked and preached and wrote and so forth. 2 final points I want to make. Increasingly, there's more discussion. There's kind of a movement toward the discussion of the genocide, not so much as a Greek or Armenian genocide, but as a Christian genocide. And I think that that's really a good thing. It contextualizes the violence in terms of the Islamization of Asia Minor. The other thing I want to say, I think it's also a good thing, though I think it needs to go even further, that we're seeing more and more scholarship by Greeks on this subject. And, interestingly, a lot of it comes out of the diaspora, both in the United States and in Australia. Not as much as I would like to see, but there needs to be more research into the subject. I recently came across an article by a French scholar who is based in Turkey, and his thesis in this article was that the resettlement, so-called, of Armenians and Greeks in the period beginning in 1914 was a reasonable and legitimate response to the national aspirations of these two ethnic groups. And of course, that is false, and it's a dangerous proposition. But there is an industry, let's call it that, a scholarly industry in Turkey that churns out lots of articles of this sort that are sort of an apology or a softening of the events that happened through those period as a way to sort of, in scholarly terms, to negate the reality of this Christian genocide. So I would like to see much more scholarship, especially from Greek universities, on this subject. I think currently it falls short of what we see, especially from the Armenians, and of course what we see from the Jews on their experiences in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. So I'm gonna close there, Lou, and thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about Smyrna.
No, Lou, thank you so much. And it's interesting that you should bring up the Jews or the Israelis, let's say. The recent, not recent, but fairly recent book, the 30-year genocide, which really goes deeply into it and calls it what it is, which is what you mentioned, really a Christian genocide from 1894 in their particular book to 1924, the so-called 30-year genocide. The other thing for the audience, I think what's important to understand is that World War I did not really end. At least in that part of the world, when people say World War I ended, because in fact it had not ended. They did not recognize. I'm talking about the nationalist forces did not recognize the treaties, etc., of Savvas or what have you that were signed in 1920. So in effect, the war had not ended. But meanwhile, you mentioned this. You mentioned the French, for example, and others who didn't do much to stop the killing. For example, when they came into the city, when the Turkish national forces came into the city, one of the first things that they did was murder Chrysostomos, the metropolitan Chrysostomos of Smyrna. And what was interesting is when you read the literature, the French troops were there and they were ordered to stand down. They were ordered not to get involved in that particular circumstance. What's also not mentioned, to a certain degree, is that there were things going on in terms of agreements, etc., with the national forces, with France. Obviously, the USSR had supported, the nationalist forces in the so-called Greco-Turkish War. I call it so-called because I'm not sure if it was a war, technically, when you think about the fact that the war was not over. But the Allies were not there. There were obviously the oil fields that were involved, okay, and people were making their own deals with regards to the nationalist forces not to take over certain oil fields. And so there's a lot of things behind the scenes that were taking place and why people didn't do the right thing. I should mention also, it's not many people, but there was a Japanese ship that has been verified, the Tokimaru, which did come into the port. And it did take a couple of voyages or what have you, and did save about 2,000 Greeks and Armenians in their ships. And I was honored, actually, to give an award to the Japanese ambassador to Greece in Athens this past year, relating to that particular incident and the honoring of the Japanese people and sailors, let's say, for what took place in the burning of Smyrna. Thank you again, Lou, for being with us always. when we discuss, obviously, Smyrna and other things around the genocide. Our next presenter or panelist is Vassilios Meichanetsidis, who's a postdoctoral researcher, teaching assistant at the National University of Athens. His specific research interests in genocide studies include Greek genocide in the Ottoman Empire between 1913 and 1923, genocidal intent, the genocidal process, comparative genocide, both Greek and Armenian, cultural genocide, ethnocide, recognition, and memory. His selected publications include The Genocide of the Ottoman Greeks, Studies in the Greek-Sponsored Campaign of Extermination of the Christians of Asia Minor, 1912 to 1922 and its aftermath, History, Law, Memory, with others in that particular case, The Genocide of the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire, 1913 to 1923, a comprehensive overview, The Destruction of the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire, 1913-1923, as we indicated, aspects of the genocide of the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire, which was written in the Hellenic language, cultural genocide, historical and comparative aspects, the Greek genocide case, and also, among others, the genocide of the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, 1913, denial, oblivion, misprision, memory. Thank you so much, Vasily, for being with us today. Vasily, unmute, Vasily. Yeah, thank you.
Hello to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I was very happy to hear the two previous speakers and the issues they raised. I will speak about genocidal intent. Intent is the essential component of genocide. Thus, if the existence of a program is proved, it testifies to the existence of the essential conceptual component that the crime of genocide has been perpetrated. Since the crime of genocide is a state crime, the program, in order to be within the frames of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, has to be sponsored by the state itself. In the case of the Greek genocide, this applies to the government and authorities of the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, from a strictly legal perspective, genocidal intent can be inferred from a pattern of systematic and repeated attacks or the targeting of a group atrocities on a large scale or repetitive, destructive, and discriminatory acts. This was the conclusion of a ruling of the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia. Now, we have a thesis for the Greek genocide from 1913 to 1923. And one of the major issues that came up was to prove genocidal intent against the Ottoman Greek population. Generally speaking, there have been two opinions. There is one claiming that there was no genocidal intent vis-à-vis the Greeks, and there is another opinion, and scholars who have supported that opinion is Donald Bloxham, Boris Bart, and some others, Michael Schwartz, etc. On the other hand, there is an opinion supporting that there was genocidal intent against the Ottoman Greek population, and scholars who support that opinion is Tessa Hoffman, Hannibal Travis, Theodosios Kyriakidis, myself, and some others. These names are just indicative names for both groups of scholars supporting whether there is or there is no genocidal intent. Some of the scholars who have supported the fact that there was no genocidal intent are scholars who have written about the Greek genocide in the past, when also the academic scholarship concerning the Greek genocide was much less than it is nowadays. Now, roughly speaking, the scholarly debate around Ottoman genocidal intent can be divided into an intentionalist and functionalist approach. The intentionalists underline the aspect of continuity of genocidal intent throughout Ottoman history, mainly owing to the Islamic doctrines and traditions, which imported an inherent resistance to change, the Ottoman Turkish propensity to resolve acute conflicts by resorting to violence, and a Turkish subculture of massacres. While functionalists view World War I and the subsequent Greco-Turkish War as a critical cause which provided an entirely new set of circumstances upon which the execution of the Christian genocide became contingent. Functionalists also view the Islamic religion and religion-based violence as providing only part of the context within which the Christian genocide was carried out. I have written an article, and a rather extensive article on that issue, which has been published in that book, The Displacement, Extinction, and Genocide of the Pontic Greeks, 1916 to 1923, and was edited by Medardus Brel and Christine Platt. And so in that article, I deal with the issue of genocidal intent in a rather thorough manner. Now, my view is that the intentionalist approach to genocidal intent is very valid. In that article, I deal with the conditions for the emergence of genocidal intent, with the Kemalist ideology and the Kemalist program of homogenization, with the unfolding of the genocidal process, especially in the third phase of the Greek genocide, that is in the Kemalist phase. And there I bring forward the ideological preparation for the genocide, which was a synthesis between religion and nationalism. Then I deal with the elimination of potential resistance in order to be able to perpetrate the genocide, the decapitation of the victim group in 1921, and then with the methodology of the genocidal process. My interest is now in that intentionalist approach, and in the role that religion has played in that sense, and how religion was important in that intent. In order to make a convincing narrative, if you want, a convincing thesis on the importance of religion in informing and enhancing the genocidal intent, one should go back into the study of the Islamic religion. So I think it is very important to see the perception that Islam has on the others, how Islam views the others, the non-Muslims actually. And so I bring some evidence that the non-Muslims are considered infidels, enemies of Allah, and have no right of life on earth in general, but there are certain conditions that may allow those infidels to remain alive. The second aspect that one should know in order to be able to, to evaluate the significance of religion is the status of the zimmis. What is the status of the zimmis in an Islamic society? And the zimmis can be alive when a city generally is not conquered by sword, because when a city is conquered by sword in the Islamic Ottoman tradition, then most people are killed or sold as slaves. But when a city is conquered by surrender, then the Muslim authorities can show a certain mercy, and so the zimmis will remain alive, but they can remain alive under certain very strict conditions, which are part of the zimet, of the contract of submission. And if those conditions are not fulfilled by the zimmis, then the Muslim leader is allowed to kill them. One of the conditions is not to rebel. If you rebel, then the Muslim leader is allowed to kill you and to enslave the civilians, women and children, and sell them out, etc. Jihad is a very important aspect as well that one should study in order to determine the place of religion in genocidal intent. And the declaration of jihad in 1914 was important because in one way or another, that jihad, which is the last Ottoman jihad, was related to not only to the foreign powers to which the jihad was addressed, the powers of Entente, but in one way or another, that declaration was also related to the Ottoman Christians. And we have studies of Manukian and Matosian and some others, like myself, that bring forward evidence that declaration of jihad was also in one way or another indirectly related to the Ottoman Christians. The declaration of jihad revoked the protection of the zimmis under that zimet contract. So it was allowed to kill them because the jihad allows that. And of course, one should also remember the Ottoman tradition of conquest, how the Ottomans conquested cities and what happened into that context of conquest. We have substantial evidence in that regard from Byzantine and post-Byzantine sources. And maybe it would be interesting for a scholar to combine, to make a comparative study between that Byzantine and post-Byzantine cases of conquest with that of Smyrna. One could draw very interesting parallels between what happened in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries and what happened into the 19th into the 20th century. Yes. It was interesting that a few days ago, I mean, some time ago, I have discovered some evidence of the fatwa of 1821 in the context of the declaration of the Hellenic Revolution. So in that context, the fatwa and the firmans issued placed the infidel and filthy nation of the Greeks without of the law. The law in that context is the Islamic law. So the fatwa declared that those who rebelled against the Ottoman Empire in 1821 are out of the law, the Islamic law, and order, I quote, the Muslim leader to mobilize the faithful and penetrate by sword the Greeks, to enslave and sell their women and underage children, and make them slaves to the faithful Muslims, to distribute their belongings, properties among the victorious Muslims, to deliver their houses to fire and ashes in such a way that not only human voice, but not even of a cockerel may ever heard in their houses, and all Muslim faithfuls to rebel as one man and slaughter the male, enslave the women and the children, seize the properties, and extinguish from face of earth even the traces of the ungrateful and worthless for life nation of the Greeks, being certain that acting in such a manner they implement the sacred orders of the Koran and the sacred fatwa and accomplish the wish of the great Caliph of Islam and the most powerful Sultan, sovereign of all universe. So that is the fatwa is supposed to be the fatwa of 1821. And it is interesting in that regard to see what is described here that in many ways resembles what has been done in 1914 onwards. So in my opinion, contrary to what many scholars may think, religion and religious difference played a significant, if not a determining role in the overall process of destruction of the indigenous Ottoman Christians, both from an intentionalist as well as from a functionalist approach, even if religion was also instrumentalized by the Ottoman Muslim leaderships. Although religion and religious differences alone may not be able to fully explain the destruction and need to be combined with other factors, for example, socioeconomic and political ones, the Christian ethno-religious identity of the victims was the primary factor for their being targeted by the Ottoman Muslim leaderships. These Sunni leaderships pursued the creation of a Muslim state, which only later, in the second phase, became ethnically Turkish. Greeks and other Christians were targeted not only as members of a non-Muslim ethno-religious community, but also as holders of important socioeconomic or political offices and roles. From a socioeconomic and political point of view, most of the victims were actually villagers and of a second-class political status compared to the ruling Sunni Muslim majority, and were from an agrarian background, with only some members of the community holding important positions, which were again conditional to the acceptance of the ruling Muslim majority. Moreover, those Greeks or Christians who opted for conversion to Islam were typically not killed, but allowed to remain in Turkey and become Turks. There are even nowadays many Grecophone Christians who were Islamized during the genocide or before. In addition, most Turcophone Christians were also killed and exiled for being Christians, albeit Turcophones. The Assyrians Arameans did not maintain significant socioeconomic or political roles in the empire and were rather few in number, yet they were targeted as being Christians. The Alevites were later targeted as heretical, while the Muslim Kurds were targeted only when they claimed a different identity or a different state. Christians were targeted because of historical and contemporary religious, political, and cultural anti-Christianism that culminated in two jihads: a religious jihad against Christians in 1914 in the context of World War I, and ethno-religious jihad in 1919 in the context of Greco-Turkish war. Of course, you know, there are other important aspects that played a significant role in the process, like Turkish nationalism, irredentism, fear for the collapse of the empire. I deal with all these issues in the article. But here I only raised up the religious aspect of the genocidal process and the contribution of religion into the genocidal intent. But when one sees the whole process holistically, of course, you know, underlines also other important aspects that played a significant role: nationalism, ethno-nationalism, etc., etc. I just here dealt with that religious aspect a lot.
Great. Thank you so much, Vassili, for that presentation. There were many fatwas, quite frankly. It wasn't no. I introduced Saba. If you can, just please stop.
No, I took to acknowledge the Dr. Gocek who joined.
No, I'm going to introduce her. Just give me a second, because
Can I just ask a question? Wasn't this supposed to start at 3 p.m. Eastern time? Am I?
No, it's 2 p.m. It's 2 p.m.
What do you mean?
It was 2 p.m. Let's not worry
2 p.m.
I thought it was 3 p.m. at least.
Well, that's okay. That's all right.
We're on the East Coast, so I'm sorry. I thought.
No apologies. Vassili, just a couple of things. Okay, there were fatwas not only in 1821, obviously, but also in the uprising in the 1770s, where the Sultan actually did a fatwa to exterminate the whole population of the Moria, for example, in the Peloponnesus. You did in fact discuss some of the religious issues, and you're absolutely correct. But I think that there was a transition. The Caliph was overthrown. And to the extent that you had others who came into place, nationalists, etc., and you had other philosophies. For example, Ziga Gökalp, for example, the growth of nationalism within Turkey. It transformed itself to a certain degree. Yes, it was religious. But there were other aspects of it that were taking place in my mind. But we'll discuss those a little bit later. I'd like to introduce right now.
Just a second, Lou. Yes, it is important to note that both Armenians and Greeks were accused by the Turks for rebelling.
Yes, of course.
The accusation against Armenians in 1914-15 was rebellion, and the accusation against the Pontic Greeks in 1919 was rebellion.
Yes.
So rebellion was, according to Islamic law, punished by extermination.
No, of course, we know that, but I think the total focus on just religion is not.
Yeah, I
totally
said
adequate. That's all I'm saying.
it was not only religion. I said it was many other things as well. But I spoke on religion in this particular.
No, of course, I just wanted for the audience to accent the fact that there was a growth of nationalism and religion. It always played an aspect to it, but there were other factors that took place. In particular, some of the philosophies that came out with Ziga Gökalp in Turkey. Our next panelist, I'd like to introduce Dr. Fatima Mujia Gocek. She's a Turkish sociologist and professor at the University of Michigan. She wrote the book Denial of Violence in 2015 concerning the persecution of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, for which she received the Mary Douglas Award for Best Book from the American Sociological Association. In 2017, she won a Distinguished Faculty Achievement Award from the university, having obtained her BS and MS at the Gocek University. My apology for not pronouncing it correctly, in Istanbul. She went to Paris to learn French. In 1981, she moved to the Princeton University, where she received an additional MS degree in 1984 and a doctorate in 1988. Since 1988, she has been lecturing at the University of Michigan. She was appointed a full professor in 2012 and lectures at the university at the Department of Sociology and Programs in Women's Studies. She was a signatory to I Apologize campaign in 2008, which demanded that Turkey takes responsibility for the massacres inflicted on the Armenian population in 1915. Welcome, Fatma, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, and I apologize because
no apologies.
It was 3 p.m. Eastern time is how I had it on my thing, and people don't know Michigan because Michigan is the westernmost East Coast,
we know.
rather than the Midwest. People think we're in the Midwest. We are, but not temporarily, which is weird. But yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, but. How long do I have? Let me just get that down first. How long?
Don't worry about your time. You can do 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever.
Okay.
You're with us. There's no time limits there.
Okay, so I will just talk about sort of what I think are the main elements of the Greek genocide then, if that's okay. I mean, based on what I have done, obviously, with the Armenian genocide. So what I think is most important is the fact that I take a much longer time period, especially when I was doing the denial of violence. I tried to understand when the violence against non-Muslims started to not be prevented or held accountable by the state. I mean, that probably is the most crucial difference. As Hannah Arendt says, with violence, the transformation, she says, from subject to citizenship is very important because what happens is that when you are subjects, you are a part of the community. In general of Greeks or Armenians, or whatever, and as you know, their patriarch or their religious leader is the one who is sort of accountable to the Sultan for the community. That is sort of how it works. Even they have their internal legal, processes. They also have when they have problems. Actually executing, some decisions that are legal decisions that are taken, then of course the Ottoman state intervenes and makes sure it gets carried out. So that is sort of how it works. It was subjected, but when you turn to citizenship, it's a one-on-one relationship. And Hannah Arendt says, in the case of the Jews, what happened was that, when they were protected as a community by the state, they were there, and your identity meant something different in the sense that the state intervened and was able to basically make sure things worked out. But when you are an individual, you have an individual personal relationship established with the state. And what that does is that sort of you no longer have that communal protection over you. So each case becomes a case negotiated with the state without the protection or the support or the presence of your community. And Hannah Arendt said that was sort of how they then started going after rich Jews and others, and one by one, and since there was no community mobilization or representation, it was much easier than to carry out the violence. Of course, also connected with the legal system and others there as well. So that was crucial. Because of that transition, I chose the beginning of Western European modernity. And there's a lot of literature on that, and it's sort of the way it redesigned societies from a faith-based, religious-based, country to one that is based on reason or the constitution and things like that. I mean, so that is sort of the important, let's say, transition from one system to the other. So that is why I looked and I decided that Selim III, who came to power in 1789, just by chance, was like the first one to systematically modernize the Ottoman state. And then it sort of continues all the way, obviously, to 2009, when I had to stop because I had to print, publish what I had. But what is important for me in that process was I didn't do it through state documents. I chose purposefully memoirs so that I could see how people were making sense, or what was happening about the violence against the Armenians from the grounds up. And of course, one issue with memoirs is that it is if you use one or two, I mean, it's very hard to then get a sense of what's going on. So what I did was, in my total sort of ambitious approach, I said, I'll look at all the books printed, all memoirs printed in Turkey, in Turkish, after 1928 script revolution. And I ended up trying to read all of them. There were probably like 700-800 of them. And I put aside all the ones that dealt with minorities in one capacity or minoritized peoples. I also don't like the word minority, because if you think about minority, especially for Armenians and Greeks, for whom these were their ancestral lands, they literally became minoritized on their own land. I mean, so that is why I prefer to use minoritized. I mean, there's also, of course, the Jews, in addition, because those were the three protected communities, the millet. In addition to the Greek room, of course, there are the Armenians, mostly Armenian Orthodox, and then the Jews. But the Jews were a much smaller group, and part of the reason as to why there wasn't, there was, of course, anti-Semitic, the pogroms also included the Jews, but not to the same degree as the Greeks and the Armenians, I would argue, because they didn't have claims on the ancestral lands that Turks were trying to claim for themselves. I mean, they were left in Jerusalem and such were sort of considered Arab provinces, not a part of Anatolia, Asia Minor as such. So then when I looked at all these memoirs, I mean, and in it, for example, I also have Yorgo Zarifi. I don't know if, I mean, you work on him, but his memoirs were fascinating. And there were also many, of course, prominent Greek business people, many of whom, of course, had to leave, albeit violently, from the 1820s onward. What is so that is the thing. When I looked at these memoirs, it turns out most of the ones that were printed in Turkey in Turkish, and this is the politics of translation as well, seem to belong to the perpetrators. In my case, Turkish Ottoman officers and officials. And as a consequence, I literally sort of tried to understand what was happening, the violence from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Also significant among them was the fact that nationalism, of course, emerges as a big theme because they justify the violence by arguing, that Turkey is for the Turks and all that. And the exclusionary thing comes in with the Young Turks in a proto-nationalist way and then becomes fully nationalist, of course, with the establishment of the Turkish Republic. What is now, having said all of that, that's sort of the frame. And then I argue that the genocide against them took through phases. First, sort of the origins of the genocide were so defined that it was, if you think about genocide as an act, they said it's all because of Western intervention. They're the ones who are messing things up. So they blamed the West, as they're still doing to this day, rather than say that this was an internal problem. That they were unable to include actually Armenians or any of the millet equally, because ever since, of course, 1839 onwards, 1839, 56, 76 are all attempts to actually reform the empire. And and what's most important there, what the reform means is that they all have to be included as equal citizens or equal subjects. And of course they couldn't because of all the things that were going on. And also they couldn't because they wanted to keep the Islamic Sharia law, but the law itself automatically privileged, of course, the Muslims over the rest. And of course, that's why the Kurds survived that time round. But that afterwards, after the Republic was founded, then the Kurds religiously also got. That's why I'm now working on a book on the Kurdish genocide, actually, based on contemporary interviews to see how that would work. So then that is probably the first phase. So I say the first phase is the origins of the genocide are basically blamed on others rather than, taking the responsibility and being accountable, of course, in the first place. So then the second one sort of occurs with the actors. Basically, it's the Young Turks, the Young Turk government in cahoots with, of course, the local notables, mostly Muslim and others, that carried out and executed the genocide. But they instead blame it on wartime conditions and their sort of lack of, concern. And they say, well, this was just a part of the violence that occurred as a part of the war, the First World War. Again, that of course too is not, the case. they intentionally, we know, started this process, and many have demonstrated this exclusion, and then it sort of continued. So then the other, I also looked then at the sort of denial of responsibility is the last one, where they, of course, do not take responsibility, and they blame it on others. That's like the last stage. So I take it through these stages that make up collective violence over time. So what's different from in my approach is the sources I use and the and also you know, how I approach it temporally as a process. What's interesting now, let me tell you what I remember with respect to the Greeks. How did the Greeks sort of came into this picture? At least the treatment, you know, against the Greeks. When did it change? What's fascinating, to me it's fascinating, but obviously it's also depressing, is that the Greek case is extremely important in the Ottoman history, because it's the first time one of the subjects of the empire successfully rebelled against the Ottoman Empire. I mean, you know, so that is, it sets a precedent on how they treat all the other minorities after that, including the Armenians. And the Jews never made such a claim too, so maybe that's what's also different. But with the Kurds and others, because anytime anyone sort of expresses you know, that they're not happy, they want to go on their own or such, immediately the Greek case comes to mind, and they're saying, oh my God, these are separatists, they're going to establish their own thing, and it's going to fall apart. I mean, so in a way, the empire is going to fall apart. So that is sort of why I think the Greek case is important. And we know, for example, from Carter Finley's work on the Ottoman officialdom, that even though with the first reform attempts in 1339 and 56, even though they tried to bring in Greek, especially, of course, because they had much higher literacy, Greeks and Armenians and Jews too, to important positions in the sort of administration, that unfortunately didn't go well. They also allowed them to sort of enter Galatasaray Lyceum, which was like feeding the officialdom. With time, there was no trust. The Ottoman Turks couldn't trust the Greeks or Armenians or the minority, the millet people, and that is why they eventually lost and had to literally were contained in business and the marketplace, where they had been initially assigned, of course. Now, in that context, so the first phase with the Greeks sort of emerges with their rights. It's even before 1839 with the reform movement. First, obviously, a case against. And then after and that is also why Armenians enter the officialdom much more in larger numbers to replace the Greeks, who of course have been eliminated one way or the other. So that is the first phase. The second phase of sort of the Greek presence and it's sort of being a challenge happens in 1912-13, before World War I, because especially working with the Germans, I guess, and sort of thinking of the security of the empire and stuff, they decide, who decides specifically? It's the Young Turks, but within the Young Turks, it's the special organization, Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, basically, that sort of puts these security issues in place. And that Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa is, of course, the origin of the Derin Devlet, or the deep state we have in Turkey today. So that also has continued over time. And what happens in that context with the Derin Devlet is they decide that there is too much of a concentration of Greeks on the Aegean coast. And I mean, and this is I mean, for me, sad, but I'll also explain. What happens is that Celal Bayar, who then becomes the is the president during the pogroms, 1955 pogroms, basically, 6, 7 September. He is the one who is literally sent, and he is one of the few civilian Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa people. The others are all generals, soldiers of various kinds. And we know this from the memoirs of Kuşçubaşı. Kuşçubaşı was also sort of the head of, for a while, and he comes from a Circassian family. He was the head of the special organization for a while. And in his memoirs, he talks about how Celal Bayar and others would systematically go and literally terrorize the Greek population by, burning down arson, their houses and their stores, looting them, destroying the cemeteries, and basically raping, doing all kinds of violence against them, and which is, of course, very dramatic, but you understand why they then use exactly the same tactics in 1955 too. So that, I think, is important in that context. And so they literally force hundreds of thousands of Greeks to flee to Greece then. And now there are many Turkish scholars who have started working on, each sort of town, a Greek town, and how it impacted this. So that seems to be the second, with respect to Greeks, the skirmish. And what's important in terms of the Armenian one that comes later, Şükrü Kaya is also involved, and he is very prominent in the destruction of Kurds later on. But they use the experience, and Armenians and Kurds, they use this experience of destruction of the Greeks, in this way. The people, the Young Turk people who are involved in it, then are assigned to be heading projects of basically destroying the Armenians and then destroying the Kurds. So there is this very interesting sort of violence that continues through this leadership. What is so that is one, the second important thing that happens right before the war. Of course, during the war, there is a very interesting shift that because I think Greece takes time to get into the war. Initially, they are not included in the deportations. And we know, and within the Armenians also, they technically were not supposed to take Protestants, and this was only the Greek Armenian Orthodox who was going there. But in this context, we have, I have a very interesting personal account from Sarkis Seropian, who was the editor of Agos, who died. But he was from Adapazarı. His family was from there. His father, his great-grandfather became a doctor, a physician in Trabzon. And his grandmother and aunt went there because the doctor's wife was delivering a baby, so they were there to sort of help. But at the time, the person there, the Young Turk commander there, chastised the doctor for treating not civilians instead of only doctors, and as a consequence, as only soldiers. So then he put him in one of the caravans that was going through, and he perished. And then that left the mother, the whole, and the 3 kids, and they were put into the next caravan. As they were coming down to Agen, which is down south, they would speak Greek among themselves. And why would they speak Greek? I learned this from Spiros Briones. It turns out at the time when during Byzantine times they used to the Greeks and Armenians too, obviously, had to do their liturgy in Greek. And as a consequence, they learned Greek among themselves. So as they were going down with the other Armenians, when they wanted to talk to each other, they would use Greek to communicate. And one of the gendarmeries, who was taking them down, said, "Wait a minute, are you Greek? If you're Greek, you're not supposed to be in this, deportation. If you're not Armenian." And they, of course, she said, "Yes, we're Greek." I mean, how are they not going to tell? And then that is why they kept them in Agen to find out what their origins were. And what happened was they sent a telegram to Trabzon, but I don't know. They probably said, probably, we don't know. I mean, what knowledge do they have? Or do they care, as a matter of fact? So as a consequence, they stayed there in Agen, and I went to Agen because my family is, one part of my family is from there, many generations ago. So then, because of course, it sort of being in Agen, when they were there initially, the Agen population was also like 30%, I think Armenian, I don't know, 10-20% Greek, and I mean it was a very mixed population. But now, of course, there's no one except the Muslims, and that's a whole different story. But that is sort of that kind of destruction starts occurring, of course, as I said, during the First World War, as suddenly all these sort of definitions and violence is applied almost, and there is no accountability if people make a mistake. And I mean, and arrest someone else, just like it seems in the United States today. I mean, it's very hard to hold Trump accountable in a similar way, but I mean, nevertheless, I'm just being catty there. So then the second, what I have is another memoir of this Suat Dervish, who is actually a journalist. And in 1919 or 18, she was, her father had been made the mutasarrif, I think, of Adana or someplace, and they were going there, and by somehow on their route, they Suat Dervish sort of says, she recounts seeing sort of a girl dressed in black, but half of her body was missing, and I mean, she had long hair, whatever, and then it was obviously a corpse. But they also saw these people coming in droves, all dressed in black. And she asked her dad, "What's happening?" And it turns out he said, "Well, it's the Pontic genocide." I mean, he didn't say the Pontic genocide. And he said, "These are room we're not supposed to intervene," but they were obviously being thrown out. So that's why memoirs are very interesting, because it gives you all this sort of details that people, are not aware. So that, of course, is the one after that. And then that happened in the First World War. And then, of course, when you start the Republic, right before the Republic, there's also another big round, of course, during the independence struggle, so to speak, as again, especially in that case, Mustafa Kemal, the Kemalists cut telegraphic communication with actually Anatolia. so that the Sultan is not able to hear about anything that goes on. And that is why we do not have much documentation about, obviously, the genocide that went on right before the formation of the Turkish Republic. And with the Turkish Republic, of course, it sort of becomes more systematic. They have vatandaş Türkçe konuş, speak Turkish, and then all these other things that culminate, of course, in the pogroms of 1955. And then after that, there is, in addition to that, in 1974, 1964, is it? Yes. Forced, they said you have to choose either a Greek passport or a Turkish one. You can't have both. And they were supposed to leave with only one suitcase and nothing. I mean, so what's very important is during the summers, my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, had bought 2 mansions on Prinkipos Island, there, and they were actually, I mean, later on when I, of course, learned to visually identify Greek and Armenian built buildings, I could see these were both there next to each other. And we also had some Greek, still, Greeks who were vacationing there, but that was, they all disappeared after the 60s. So in a way, it's interesting because the house, the apartment house in sort of the Pera place, Pera region, where my father also father's father had a building or 2. Those were also Greek buildings. So I had a talk with my father, and he said, "Why are you so obsessed about these minorities? What's wrong with you?" And I said, "Look, this is extremely important because we don't normalize and we normalize and naturalize the violence and don't talk about it." He said, "Well," I said, "Take our case." He says, "What about our case?" I said, "Well, both of our buildings, you own, the grandfather owned, and the mansions, were Greek." He said, "Yeah, but we didn't plunder them like other people did. We actually bought them at an auction." I said, "Yeah, but it's a state auction, obviously." I said, "Yes, but did you pay full?" I mean, he was a businessman. I said, "Did you pay full price at the auction?" At that point, suddenly he understood. I mean, but I was surprised. I mean, here is an educated guy, in the States and, engineer, this, that, and the other. Why couldn't he put 2 and 2 together? That for me is always very interesting. They do not see in a way, and I'm trying to understand that selective prejudice and discrimination. But anyhow, that is, then he said, from that point onward, he never asked again, "Why are you working on this thing?" But also, I mean, to give him credit, during the 1955 events, I mean, he did, because they lived on the Prinkipos Islands, they had lots of Greek and Jewish friends, of course, whose stores were all plundered, and they sort of financially helped them again, sort of come around and supported them. So obviously, he wasn't like a rabid nationalist, thank goodness, So he continued, but he hadn't seen the violence against them, of course, because of propaganda. And that was probably all that I would sort of say in a very anecdotal, but also, some historical background. And I'll stop there.
Fatma, thank you so much for that presentation, in particular for linking not only the genocide, but going into the Istanbul pogrom and then taking it on to the Turks, to the Kurds. And it's a fascinating history how once you do something, you don't get stopped. It becomes part of
Oh, yes.
natural thing. We just
Yes.
we just get rid of our opponents.
Because let me say, I forgot. So the third one, when I'm doing it's the first, the denial of the origins, then it's the denial of the act. The act in the sense that it's a genocide, but they say, no, we were just moving them because of wartime measures or whatever. The third is the denial of actors, even though the actors who do it are officers and officials and the state literally and the local notables. In the transition from empire to republic, what happens is that the former perpetrators become the leaders of the Turkish Republic. And that, of course, normalizes and naturalizes whatever happens into action. So whenever there's an issue, like with Celal Bayar, who basically did it against the Greeks originally, the first thing they think of is violence, is the way to deal with them. And that's, I argue, and nobody has written about this yet, but why I think the 55 pogroms are a direct continuation because of Celal Bayar's leadership. And the last one, last stage is the denial of responsibility for what happened. And that's, of course, the last stage, and we know that's still continuing, unfortunately, to this day. Yes, I'll leave it there.
Fatma, thank you so much for that. Our next presenter is Dr. Theodosios Kyriakidis. He holds a PhD in modern history from the University in Western Macedonia in Greece. He graduated from the Faculty of Theology at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and attended courses at the Westfalenische Wilhelms Universitat in Munster. He has also received a diploma in Greek paleography and a master's degree in historical theology. He is an alumnus of the Genocide and Human Rights University program organized by the International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies and the History Department of the University of Toronto. Moreover, he has conducted postdoctoral research at the La Spezia University of Rome. His research interests includes the history of the culture of Greeks in Pontos and Asia Minor, as well as the genocide of the Christian population of the Ottoman Empire. He has been awarded several scholarships from institutions in Greece, Italy, and the USA. His latest works includes In the Name of Faith and Civilization, Roman Catholic Missionaries in 19th Century Pontos, which came out in 2019, and the multifaceted nature of the identity essays in Pontian Hellenism. Also, the genocide of the Christian populations in the Ottoman Empire and its aftermath, 1908-1923. He is currently a research fellow at the Chair for Pontic Studies at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and a visiting lecturer at the International Hellenic University and Hellenic Open University. Welcome, Theodosios, and thank you for being with us today.
Let me open my microphone. Thank you very much, Lou, for this invitation. It is an honor and pleasure to be with you in this distinguished panel in order to discuss some elements and some details on the genocide on the Greeks of Pontus, but in general, the genocide, the Christian genocide on the Christian population of the Ottoman Empire. Now, in the time frame I have available, I would like to comment on some elements that took place during the process of destruction that led to the genocide. The first thing I want to note is that throughout the genocidal measures taken by the Young Turks and the Kemalists, that is roughly between 1913 and 1922, we see in the archives that we have ups and downs in the genocidal process. That is, periods where intense genocidal activity is observed, massacres, persecutions, death marches in the interior of Anatolia, and other periods where this activity is reduced or ceased for a period of time. This happens because a genocide does not take place outside of its historical context. That is, that the events take place in a certain region and period. Therefore, historical contexts must be considered when interpreting events. Thus, in this case we are discussing now today, we see that the flow of events is influenced by the stance of great powers, the stance of Greece on whether or not to enter World War I, the internal resistance of the victims, such as the creation of guerrilla groups to defend themselves, and many other issues that one needs to take into consideration. Now, due to limited time, let's look at one of the ways of extermination of the target population, the death marches into the interior. One of the ways of extermination was the forced and violent deportations of populations in order to die on the road from hardships. And these deportations had not been random, but were rather the result of a systematic study of population data. Demographic anxieties shaped the deportations of the Pontic Greek population. We know from Fuatundar and Taneraksam and other scholars adequately recorded in their books that the young Turks elaborated national statistics, maps, and ethnological studies the summer of 1914, which had helped them apply a scientific way to the homogenization policy of Anatolia. So, firstly, the Greeks from 1913 and then the Armenians were distributed across the empire so that the numbers of Christians in every region would be 10%, 5%, even 2%, or even less than the remaining Muslim population. This was one of the measures they had in their mind for the assimilation of the surviving Christian population from the massacres and the harsh conditions of death marches. In other words, we know that the deportation policy had been a well-studied action in order to remove and eventually annihilate the Greeks of Anatolia. There is an example. There are several examples in the several biographies. I mentioned here one from the headmaster of a Greek school, Kyriakidis, who affirms the above in his memoirs published in 1919, saying that since 1916, most of the men in the Savvas area had either been reported or imprisoned. Women and children, said Kyriakidis, were transported to the Azizye province, where they were distributed among Turkish villages so that no more 5 or 10 of them lived in the same village. And he concluded saying that their Islamization was the ultimate goal. It is important to note that the Unionists had planned not only the expulsion, but the resettlement process as well. As soon as the authorities evacuated one village or region, they would immediately install Muslim population. Indication of the authorities' lack of intention to allow any returns is provided by the persecution, for example, of the Greeks from Giresun, who, once they were displaced and dispersed in June 1917 in Sivas, Ankara, Bolu, and other places in the interior, refugees, Muslim refugees from the Caucasus were installed in Greek homes just 2 weeks later. If the authorities intended to allow the return of the displaced, they would not allow their homes to be occupied. So in this way, they achieve a dual purpose. On the one hand, they are displacing the unwanted population, and on the other hand, they are solving the problem, a huge problem that they had, which was the accommodation of the Muslim refugees from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and other places. Now, let's see how deadly these deportations into the interior were. The first major systematic catastrophe in the western Pontus area of Samsun occurred in 1916. And these events as we will see, were well designed. First of all, according to a telegram sent to Zanik region, the authorities were asking to know how many Greeks had been moved from the particular province, where they had been sent, and how many of them had remained. They wanted to know. Unfortunately, we haven't found the answer in the reply in the archives, but we do know. What we do know is that in the months that followed the persecution and violence had escalated. And here, a significant aspect regarding this escalation of violence and deportations in the Samsun region should be further highlighted. One of the leading actors of the genocide, of both the Armenians and the Greeks, was CUP Central Committee member Valentin Sekir. So there is no coincidence that the deportation process of the Greeks became more systematic only after Valentin Sekir, reached the region in December 1916. After his arrival, people were deported from Samsun, from Giresun, and Amasya. The looting and the destruction of the deportees' villages followed after. Valentin Sekir was responsible for the systematic destruction of the Armenian population in Erzurum. And after he finished this work, he went to the Pontos area. And there are many documents, but there is a specific document which exactly describes what happened and this escalation of violence. It is archive, a document by the ambassador of Austria in Istanbul, and there one can see day by day the destruction of the Greek villages that were plundered, people got burned, rapes, etc., etc. This is a very interesting document because it describes that only during December 1916, the villages that were burned, the people who were killed, day by day, and that shows that the destruction is systematic. Similarly, the same year, we have the evacuation of the shores of the Kastamonu region, Sinope, Alajam, and other places on the Black Sea shores. And later on in December, during December 1916, again, the most richest and most affluent citizens from Samsun were arrested, put in prison, and the next day they were exiled without being allowed to take anything with them for their subsistence. The cleansing actions continued in autumn and winter of 1916 in Eboli, Sinope, Direbolu. So one has to stay in this specific period of time and see village by village, day by day, exactly and study what happened. So what we see is that in the autumn and winter of 1916, there is a systematic extermination of the Greek population. And apart from all other political events that one must take into account, it is important to note that the main operations against the Armenians and Assyrians had been completed. There were therefore available resources and personnel to be allocated to the next targeted group, which is the Greeks. Valentin Sekir is one example, but also the Russians had occupied Trebizond in April of 1916. All this political events played their role in the escalation of the violence against the Greeks. Now, in order to give you an idea how deadly this procedure was, I mean the deportations, one has to see the archives of the diplomats and the missionaries. There, the missionaries, especially the missionaries, but also the diplomats, and even the diplomats who were allies with the Turkeys, with Turkey, with the Young Turks, they underlined that deportations were equivalent to death. And indeed, one can, as one can see from the percentage of survivors, the above mentioned statement is accurate. Just to give you some examples. Tripoli, Direbolu is one of the most interesting examples. From the 13 deportees from Tripoli, the deportation that took place in 1916, only 800 Greeks survived. From 13,000, only 800 deportees survived. From 700 deportees from Tepekio of Poulanzaki, taken again in 1916, only a little bit more than 200 Greeks survived. And according to Metropolitan Bishop Germanos Karavangelis, reports from the province of Samsun, only 1/10 of those deported to the interior survived. Now let's go and say a few things about the deportations as a military necessity, the deportation due to military reasons, as is the excuse of the Young Turks, that they use the internal displacement, the deportation because of was necessary for military reasons, because the Greeks could cooperate with an imminent allied forces landing, or respectively with the Russians. Now, even if we accept the logic of military necessity behind the persecutions, behind the deportations, certain questions remain. For example, why did the authorities didn't exile only the men, but included also in the measures the women, children, and elderly as well? What was the military reason for that order? The diplomats of the time, and this is very interesting, almost all the diplomats of that time, if you see the archives, even Wagenheim, who was the German ambassador of that time in the Ottoman Empire, Kwiatowski, the Austrian consul, Pallavicini, the Austrian ambassador, etc. Of course, the missionaries. They note in their correspondence their doubts about the military necessity of the measure. And mostly they believed that, first of all, they spoke in the archives, in the correspondence, that this cruelty was unnecessary. And there is a archive from the Swedish ambassador to Istanbul, who said that he believed that the civilians were included in these deportations because in order to much easier be able to confiscate the property of the deported. This was very interesting, as saying from the Swedish ambassador. Now, with that all, I just want to close saying that the plan of extermination of the Greeks of Pontus was not a byproduct of war or a series of spontaneous, but well-studied acts of massacres and deportations of the populations in conditions that would inevitably lead to extermination, because another excuse was that we will deport them 30 or 50 kilometers to the interior. But as we have seen from the archives and the biographies, and we are preparing now a digital map with these deportations, we have seen that these deportees had to walk not 30 and 50 kilometers into the interior, but more than 600 kilometers. They ended up in Harput and Malatia, which is more than 700 kilometers into the interior. So thank you very much for.
Thank you, Theodosios. So let me ask you a couple of questions, because you mentioned in particular the Austrian and the German diplomats, okay, which I find interesting. Even though there was a loss of in World War I, the Germans and the Austrians, some of them were still in Ottoman lands. Am I wrong on this? In other words, advisors, not only diplomats, but also advisors after World War I were in fact in the Ottoman territories, and in fact around when Kemal and the other nationalists were around.
That is true.
And didn't they also see and know, and there's documentation that they were there? And I hate to say this, but even in fact expressed how to help eliminate the population. Am I wrong in this?
No, that is true. We know that the German expedition in the Ottoman Empire started with the General von Goltz, Liman von Saders, all these officials participated in this expedition. We know that, but that's why it is more interesting to see that these people wrote this thing, that these people doubt, or these people write these telegrams, sending this telegram. Of course, there is a question whether Liman von Sader or Talat Pasad was the person who started these deportations into the interior. Liman von Saders may gave the idea of deporting them 30 kilometers to the interior, and then Talat Pasad took the opportunity to expel them 700 kilometers into the interior. Of course, they collaborated. We know that. And that's why it is important to bring to the light this correspondence.
Actually,
one more question. I'm sorry. No, please ask your question.
I just was going to say it's also important in that context to think about the Young Turks and what they did. The intent is there. That was a wonderful presentation, but it was there even before 1908, when they were still in opposition. And one of the first things they did after 1908, when they came in, was to do a survey, a social survey of Anatolia, to figure out how many lived where at what point. So that was what they were going off of initially. In addition to that, we do know that Enver Pasha met systematically with all the sort of soldiers, commanders who had been commissioned throughout Asia Minor, to make sure that they came and held briefings, secret ones that nobody knew about. And I think, Taner at least argues that it was there that they decided also on how to communicate these things. Talat Pasha is definitely the brain behind it, and Hans Lukas Kieser's new book, I don't know how much it deals with it, but he probably does. So Talat Pasha in that context becomes very crucial, and then later on Murat Bardakçı literally published his notes that he held at the time, which showed that this exact 5 to 10% policy that you were talking about. But what's also important in terms of the Pashas is that initially, you're right, it said 30 kilometers. So there is this correspondence between Cemal Pasha, who was further east in Anatolia, as well as Talat Pasha. And Cemal Pasha says, you were supposed to send these people inland, and if they are sent 30 kilometers, they should all be in Konya, not in Darul, I mean, their Zor, or all these things. So obviously there you start seeing the difference in how they change. But by that point, after 1913, basically Young Turks are also led by this military junta, on top. But that is why I think it sort of continues. The last thing I want to say is that that a similar Nubar Pasha library is very interesting, and it is by using Nubar Pasha library that recently, we have literally village by village documentation of all the Armenians. It would be interesting to ask or get in touch with them, because I bet you they will also have a lot of information on the Greek room too, because they were the other Christian population, major one, that was also persecuted later on. I mean, 1916 is there because I think Greece entered the war later, right? That's probably why.
1917,
1917. So it
1917,
was
yeah.
right before, right
November.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One more question, Theodosios. You mentioned also the missionaries, and I think also Fatma, in terms of the Armenians, we know a lot more about the Armenian genocide than we do about the Greek or even the Assyrian genocide, probably because of the missionaries, because they were in fact Protestant missionaries throughout Armenian communities, because there was also this, the missionaries were trying to convert people into different Christian religions, and they were physically there in many cases when the Armenians were being killed. So within the Hellenic population, we didn't have those type of issues, only because missionaries, quite frankly, were not able to go through the Orthodox system, let's say, and be accepted. Am I wrong on this, Theodosios?
But they were present from
They were present, yes.
Protestants were present in Pontus area from 1830, and the Catholics even earlier.
Jesuits, yeah.
And we
I
have their
worked on the
writings.
missionaries. And one of my books is based on the Vatican archives and the genocide. So this was published in Greek, and this year it is translated into English, and it will be published also into English. We have accounts on the missionaries regarding the genocide, and of course not so many as to the Armenians, but we did have, yes.
Okay, in terms of the writings of the that you had mentioned, in terms of the diplomats, the Germans, the Austrians, etc., is that also now those writings published?
They are
Okay.
published already, yes.
Everything's published.
Most of the documents.
Okay, very good. Thank
There is also, in that context, right after the Republic is established, when Mustafa Kemal comes to Izmir, and there is the famous Izmir fire, of course, that is actually set by Sakallı Nurettin Pasha with the intent to destroy, but Turks said no, it wasn't a fire. I mean, it was accidental.
Well, what they said with the Armenians put the fire on themselves.
But what's very interesting is Mustafa Kemal sent his mother to recuperate, because Ankara's weather was not good, so she was going to live in Izmir. And you know what she said? He said, make sure he doesn't stay in a formerly abandoned Greek property. So they were aware, I think, of that. Likewise, İsmet İnönü said the same thing about his mansion in Machka overlooking the Bosphorus. He says, make sure. And then the owner sort of contacted him later on. And I think he was Armenian or Greek, I don't know, but he sent them gold coins enough to buy the house on a proper sort of thing afterwards as well. But the most important thing is right after the war, because of all the violence that had happened on the Aegean coast, Halide Edip and others like Refit Halit Karay and a few others, they wanted to do have a commission to look at the violence, because there was so much violence both ways, mostly, of course, at the expense of Armenians and Greeks. But then they made a decision. They said, no, the Turkish Republic will be established on ground zero, and we will not look into the things before that. And so they consciously silenced the violence in their past. I mean,
Yes. Before I introduce our next panelists, I will say that the Greeks in Greece did the same thing. Okay, they tried to silence the conversation of what took place. I'd like to introduce now someone who is really a friend that I've known for a while. He's appeared on some of our panel discussions, in particular relating to the burning of Smyrna, and he also helped put this panel together of excellent professors and people who are associated with the genocide. So Savvas Sam Koktzoglou is a retired mechanical engineer. He received his degrees in engineering from Villanova University and the University of Pennsylvania. During his career, he worked in senior level engineering positions in both the private and public sectors in the United States and Greece. Prior to his engineering career, he served as a second lieutenant in the Greek Army Special Forces. Sam has been on the board of directors of a number of nonprofit organizations in the Chicago area. He is the author of The Greek Genocide in American Naval War Diaries, which was published in February of 2020 by the University of New Orleans Press. It is a collection and academic study of previously unpublished archival documents of the U.S. Navy, which was discovered in the U.S. National Archives. Sam is an avid reader of Greek history with special interest in the history of Asia Minor. Sam's family lost many members during the course of the genocide. His parents were refugees from Asia Minor who settled in Greece in 1922. Welcome, Sam, and thank you for being with us today, and thank you for helping put this panel together.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you for hosting this event today, and an event which also helps us not forget what happened to all these people that lost their lives, and also gives them some voice. Whether those who died during the course of this genocide or those who survived and ended up in Greece and, struggled for many years to set foot there and be able to provide for their children and so forth and so on. Thank you again. My talk, I'd like to thank the rest of the panel, which I'm honored to be among today. And I would like to say that my presentation will be very short. I will focus on the demographics of the Ottoman Empire and the Greek community in Asia Minor at that time. It is well known that the Ottoman Empire censuses were at best inaccurate enough so that we cannot reliably use those numbers and come into conclusions as to how many were the Ottomans or the Muslims and how many were the Greeks and so forth and so on. But I will attempt to give some numbers so that we get some idea about these figures. In 1914, which was prior to the Greek genocide, or at the beginning of the Greek genocide, the population of the Ottoman Empire is estimated to be about 18,500,000 approximately. There are numbers who mentioned higher numbers, but I think that's a good number to mention. Of course, this number came down to about 14.5 million after the First World War in 1919. In other words, that was approximately the number of population in the Ottoman Empire. Now, with regard to the Greek population, that number again varies considerably among sources. And one of the numbers that I was able to, I guess, settle on was approximately 1.8 million. There are others quoting 2.2 million, others quoting less than that number. So I think 1.8 is a good number, I guess, to use. And now it is also challenging from those numbers to arrive at a number of Greeks who perished during the genocide. We know that from the 1928 census in Greece, the refugees were counted to approximately 1.1 million. But again, that number is quoted as being, I guess, not in 1922, but in 1928. So it doesn't exactly reflect the number in 1922. And some historian mentions that approximately 1.5 million Greeks, refugees, I guess, came out of Turkey. And of course, a number of them ended up in different countries around the world, France, maybe United States, Russia, and so forth and so on. But so I chose, instead of something that I've tried many times in the past to calculate the actual number, to mention a number of other scholars who have approached this, I guess, and here is, what I have collected. The Israeli historians Benny Morris and Dora Zevi, in their book, The 30-Year Genocide, they mention that several 100,000 Ottoman Greeks died during this genocide. They were murdered outright or were the intentional victims of hunger, disease, and exposure. So they're talking about several 100,000, which I guess would be, in my opinion, be around, 600,000, 700,000, something in that neighborhood. Another source is political scientist and genocide historian Dr. Adam Jones estimated that the number of dead was between 500,000 and 900,000. Okay. According to acclaimed historian, Greek historian, Dr. Alexis Alexandris, who was an expert on Greek-Turkish matters and minorities, the number of Greeks from Asia Minor who cannot be accounted for was about 785,000. This number does not account for the Greeks of Eastern Thrace, in other words, the victims or the dead from Eastern Thrace. This was a project that he was going to work on. However, he passed away before he worked on that project. Finally, historian Konstantin Hadjidimitriou estimated that the loss of life among Anatolian Greeks during World War I during the period of World War I, and its aftermath was approximately 735,000. So from the above, one can, I think, conclude that we're talking about in the range of, 700,000 plus or minus. And even though others claim 1 million and even more than 1 million, and others claim less than that, I think these numbers are more realistic, in other words, to use and possibly quote. So, and lastly, I would say that the Pontos Greeks, who bore the brunt of the Greek genocide, their number of victims probably was about a third of the total, in other words. And that, I think that's a reasonable number to use. Now, allow me to just go back a little bit and talk about whether the orders during the Kemalist period, where the orders came from regarding the deportations and possibly other lethal actions against the Greeks. According to the sources, the American Naval War Diaries that I had the opportunity to publish together with the late Robert Schenck, the American commanders of the ships who were stationed in Samson many times protested to the local authorities in Samson, to the local Kemalist authorities, regarding the deportation of women and children. And the Turkish mayor of Samson, again, repeatedly says, there's nothing I can do about it. I have orders from Ankara. So it is clear that they were operating on orders from Ankara. And one would easily conclude that the person who was in Ankara was Kemal, correct? So that is, to me, a clear indication that all the deportations were centrally originated, and specifically in Ankara. And once again, we conclude that probably from Kemal or his circle of, in other words, close to him. So that is my part of the presentation, and I thank you all for coming. It was an honor to be among you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And what I'd like to do is just take a few minutes and open up the discussion among the panelists. So if there's any questions that you have of any of the other panelists, please don't hesitate to bring it up so we can just have a brief open discussion before we finalize this panel discussion. Anyone?
I think it was a very informative presentation by all of the colleagues here, or the presenters, and I hope the audience who attended the event.
So if there's no questions, why don't we do this? Why don't we go panelist by panelist and just make some brief remarks, whatever you want to discuss, basically, as just closing. So, Themistocles, can you get started? Just some final thoughts, let's say.
Yeah, that was a great panel, excellent discussion. Thanks for everyone for having me here and contributing to the discussion. I think there were a lot of good points made about the overall process of genocidal violence and the developments, political, and then the persecution of the Christian minorities. So I think we saw some similar patterns in terms of our discussion, some similar themes that came up. And I think moving forward, the scholarship, I think, will only grow, and this discussion will have more of these discussions. There'll be more of this type of research, particularly on the Greek and Assyrian cases, given they're the ones that we've only heard about in more recent times when it comes to scholarship itself. Thank you, Lou.
Thank you. Fatma, some final thoughts for the evening?
Yeah, I just
Or the day in your particular case? Well, I'm in Athens, so for me it's the evening.
Well, I first of all apologize that I didn't realize it started at 2 rather than 3. So I came late, but so I would love to, when you do have the tape, if you can send a link to the recording or something, so I can at least listen to the ones I missed right before, I came. So that's one thing. The second thing is, with respect to the Greek genocide, I totally agree. Seems to be there's a lot going on with the Assyrian genocide since Bangar. There are a couple of scholars who are working on that recently, but I would be very interested to find out about the Greek genocide, because that was one of the things I realized, especially right after the First World War, and we know the movement of into the inland with the intent to destroy. They had no intention, and further on, when they left the empire, none of them could come back, be they Greek or Armenian or Jewish. So that's another way of excluding things. But I was surprised at how little there is, but I have a feeling there would be lots of anecdotal memory evidence. So if anybody is working on that in the Greek context, I'd love to get in touch with them or something so that we can see, because I'm using interviews now with the Kurdish genocide, but in addition to interviews, I also will be using memoirs and stuff. And then what I want to do next is to bring the insights I get from the Armenians and the Kurds to understand Native Americans and African Americans in this country and what kind of genocide they were exposed to, as well. So this was extremely productive for me. I'd love to, continue on these going forward if you are having these.
No, we will, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for not only discussing the genocide that we're talking about, but linking it to the program of 1955 in September.
Well, these systematic
aspects of it. Yes, that was.
Well, can I say something about the pogroms of 55?
Please, why not?
At one time, the Turkish community in Chicago had an event where they were talking about the Armenians, and they wanted to become friends of the Armenians. And during that talk, I said, "What about the Greeks?" And then they said, "Well, there was the guy who was there was Justin McCarthy, the famous historian who, I guess, anyway, denies the Armenian and of course the Greek genocide." And the only thing he admitted is the case of the 1955 pogroms. He says, "Well, that was, the actual," he says, "thing that they shouldn't have been done." But he completely, dismissed the genocide.
Well, Veronas was mentioned, I think, by Fatma, and quite frankly, he wrote this this gigantic book that documents just about everything. Vassilios, some final thoughts for the evening or the day?
Well, to be honest, we are having the last few years, more or less since 2011, a growing corpus of bibliography on the Greek genocide, whether in its regional or in its all Ottoman dimension, because we do have bibliography on Pontus itself as a regional case, and then we have bibliography on the whole Ottoman Empire. I mean, on the whole Ottoman Empire where the Greeks were settled, the Black Sea region, the Western Asia Minor, and Eastern Thrace, more or less. And so now we have a rather cohesive genocidological thesis, to say it in that way. We have set the time frames, the beginning and the end of the process. We have been working on the intent, that is the program, the orders, and other aspects that play into that intent area. We do have studies on the number of the Ottoman Greek population, and in 1913 when the process began, and on the Ottoman Greek population in 1923 when the process more or less ended, because the process did go on until 1955 or 1964, because the deportations of the expulsions of 1964 could also be considered part of the process as well, in the line of the esteemed Professor Gocek. And we do have also studied aspects on the methodology, and we do have comparative studies on the Greek and Armenian case as well. The English books and articles are growing up more than ever. We're a bit late indeed, for certain reasons that have to do with mostly with the bilateral Greco-Turkish relations until the end of 1980s, and until the fall of the communist regime, when the Cold War ended up, and so we were somehow allowed to study that genocide, because in the past we were not allowed to study the genocide in order not to bother the Greco-Turkish relations. In some, we have done a lot. We have studies on cultural genocide as well. In many ways, we are in a very good point. And the most important thing I should mention is that we are having a growing number of scholars who are not Greek and who study the Greek genocide. Of course, we do have certain people denying the genocidal intent, but okay, this is part of the story. It can be attributed to various reasons why this happens, but anyway, we are progressing very fast and in a very important way.
Can I ask you a question, Vassilios? We in terms of the Greek government, etc., not recognizing the dates, etc., really emphasizing the genocide at all until the 1990s. They recognized the Pontian, they recognized the Asia Minor. Has there been an official recognition by the Hellenic government relating to Thraki, the Eastern Thrace?
Look, we do have 4 axes of genocide denial. One comes from Turkey. One comes from the West, for certain reasons. One comes from Greece, for certain reasons. And one was somehow, how would I say, natural, that or justified, in the sense that certain scholars brought forward some academic issues pertaining to the Greek case, mostly because they did not have enough access to sources. And so they thought intent was not there or whatever. Now, with the Greek government, we do have two dates, as you mentioned, one for Pontus, one for Western Asia Minor. And now there is a third date for Thrace, but it is somehow peculiar. But this is because the whole story of recognition began wrongly in the 80s. In what sense? First, the Pontic Greeks raised up the issue and got recognized. Then the Western Asia Minor Greeks got raised up the issue in Smyrna and got recognized. And then the third ones were the Eastern Thracians who raised up the issue and got recognized. The right way should have been to raise one single claim and one single thesis, like the Armenians, regardless of the regional differentiation in the genocidal process, which regional differentiation appears in the Armenian genocide as well, and in the Holocaust as well. I mean, you have regional differences in how many Armenians were killed and how they were killed, and you have similar regional differences in the Holocaust as well, how many Jews from Greece were killed and from Denmark and from Bulgaria. But all these regional differences and other differences do not cancel the thesis of a total genocide.
Right.
I mean,
if I may ask a question related to that to Dr. Meichanetsidis. What about Cyprus? Does the Cyprus issue itself also impact Greek genocide recognition by the Greek state? I mean, forget the Turkish state; they can't even recognize Armenian genocide. But you know, what about the Greek state? Yeah.
The Cyprus, mostly what impacted from the Greek side, the delay in recognition was somehow the Treaty of Lausanne, then certainly the Greco-Turkish friendship of Venizelos and Mustafa Kemal Pasha. Even the Metaxas was also on that same line, the Greek dictator in the 30s.
Yeah.
And even the military junta was in favor of Helleno-Turkism, of Greek-Turkish friendship. That was, on the one hand, the need for a Greco-Turkish friendship, which was endogenous, and the need for a Greco-Turkish friendship, which was exogenous, coming from NATO. So these two needs, the endogenous of the Greek leaderships to have a Greco-Turkish friendship after 1923 and after 1930, and then the need to have a Greco-Turkish friendship within NATO influenced that delay in recognition. Of course, someone could add the trauma of the defeat, could mention the national division between Venizelists and monarchists, and how the genocidal process, the outcome of the Asia Minor expedition had an impact on these internal Greek civil strife, and many other reasons. But the most basic two ones were the endogenous Greek-Turkish friendship and the exogenous Greek-Turkish friendship coming from NATO.
Thank you so much.
If I may ask a question.
Cyprus somehow had, how do you say, an impact towards genocide recognition, because for some scholars, Cyprus is the end of the process and not 1955. But you know that the Turkish authorities wanted to continue that process somehow in Cyprus as well and get there a Turkish state. by throwing away the Greek Cypriots from the occupied territories. On the other hand, Cyprus had an impact that, you know, a trauma, again, a new trauma, because it was similar to 1922.
I just want to make a clarification. I think the Greek genocide was recognized by the Greek parliament, not by the government itself. Has not actually come out and said, well, this was a genocide. I think it was the
No, that's not
that
true.
voted.
No, that's not true. The parliament recognized
Yes.
the two cases, Pontus and Western Asia Minor. And what the parliament has recognized and the president of the republic has signed into law, this binds the government as well. We don't need a separate recognition from the government, like in the United States of America or in Australia, for instance. I mean, once the parliament recognizes something, that is valid for the entire state.
Right, but it hasn't come out. The government in international forums has not said, look, this is what happened based on, you know, blah, blah. It hasn't. It's okay. It is by the parliament.
That was because of that Greek-Turkish friendship, not to, and of course that is changing in the last years.
Right.
And the Greek governments are more vocal than ever before.
Yeah, meanwhile they're meeting with each other and having dinner, but that's okay. That's okay. There's also, I think, not mentioned, but there's also a trauma between the Greeks in Greece and the Greeks in Cyprus because of other issues, juntas, etc. With that, Theodosios, some final thoughts relating to the discussion.
Yeah, I would like to add the aspect of the institutions. The Greek genocide during the past years, and even if we accept some examples, even now, was and still is somehow in an institutional non-existence. That means that we don't have departments, we don't have professors, we don't have scholarships, we don't have young students who can study, who can research the issues in doctoral thesis, postgraduate students. You see, we speak about the Armenians, but you know, the Armenians had, I give one example. From 1955, they had the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and so many departments all over the world. Well, the Greeks, on the other hand, haven't organized these studies. And I have seen this difference when the chair of Pontic Studies was established, not by the state, by an individual who funded the chair in a Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. The change, how rapidly the whole field, at least from what I can see, changed. So now we have also doctoral students, we have postgraduate students, we have scholarships, we have publications, conferences, etc., etc. So this is something that we need to fix. This is something that we need to change. That's what I wanted to add to that discussion today.
Actually, just to say, we started the workshop on Armenian Turkish scholarship for that reason specifically, because Jureri Libaridian and Ron Suni said Armenians are so averse to working on their own genocide because it's so politicized. We want to start a whole new generation of students who know both, Armenian and Turkish, and who can work with us all together. And then literally, we started in 2000, and in the next decade, we transformed the field accordingly. So I'll be more than happy to share my experiences doing that, and what you can do with workshops. I think that scholarly workshop is one way of sort of doing it, by opening it to the media and everything as well, at least certain sessions. Yeah, sorry. And I will send you all of my books electronically so that at least you can look at my stuff.
No, thank you for that. Theodosios, let me ask you a question. Is part of the issue that when these refugees, let's say, came from Turkey, etc., that they weren't really accepted by the local population? Am I wrong in that? And has that generationally affected the thought process of even discussing the genocide among Hellenic people in general?
That is true. That is true. They had several problems faced not only by the government, also by the locals here, for several reasons when they came. But there is a lack of understanding how important this portion of the whole Greek population is for the Greeks, because there are approximately 20-30% of the whole population, and it is unacceptable that you have so large proportion of the Greek population and you don't have any professors, chairs, departments to study what happened by the government, not by the individuals, by the government. This had to be a policy from the government, not by the individuals. And when, in 1922, we had so many ceremonies about the 100 years from the Lausanne Treaty and the exchange of population, and nobody thought that, okay, we don't need to organize only commemorative events, but we have to sit down and see strategically how we can develop the field. This is the problem.
Very good.
Well, I think one of the big reasons is the fact that because the brunt of the genocide was in Pontos and, of course, in western Anatolia, the rest of the Greeks, who were the majority, did not consider that as part of their own experience. They thought that, well, these are the Asia Minor refugees, the Pontic Greeks, or the
well, let's be blunt. They used to call them. Let's be blunt.
What?
They used to call them Turcospori and Gaurtofagades. Okay,
Yep.
so let's be blunt about it.
But the thing is, they didn't consider, just like the Armenians have one whole, nationalities is embracing the cause, and like also the Jewish community is embracing, whether they were subjected or not to the Holocaust, they accept this as a part of their own history and parts of their own suffering. And that's not the case with the Greeks. The Greeks considered, well, the mainland Greeks who say, well, those are some other Greeks, that we don't. So I think that's one of the big reasons why.
I tend to agree with you, Sam. I tend to agree with you on that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's far more complicated than actually this. Okay, it is true that the Asia Minor catastrophe, not the defeat of the army, but the process of destruction of Asia Minor Hellenism, so to say, that began in 1913 and ended up in 1923. That was the greatest catastrophe of Hellenism throughout its history, because it signified the end of Asian Hellenism after more than 3,000 years of existence. As such, this is the greatest catastrophe, even greater than the fall of Constantinople, because Greeks were wiped out from Asia Minor once for all. And Theodosios, my colleague, is absolutely right in complaining why that catastrophe is not part of academic study with etc. And this is also a thing I wonder about. But the reason is multidimensional, of course. It is not monocausal, why it is not part of the consciousness. And I think that the largest share in responsibility is the fact that it was combined with the army's defeat. And then there was responsibilities, and then it was an issue. Was it a responsibility of the Venezuelans who went there, or was it a responsibility of the royalists who took up the expedition and ended in a disaster? Although the process, the genocidal process, had begun in 1913. So that division, whose responsibility was the army's defeat and the final phase, is a terrible intellectual and psychological and moral process, and nobody wanted to deal with it because it was extremely painful. That, you know, the whole thing ended up in such a terrible disaster. And then Helleno-Turkism, Hellenic-Turkish friendship, and then NATO, and then there was a division in responsibility because Western historiography and Soviet historiography both blamed the Greeks for for that defeat as well, and for that process as well. And then the whole 20th century was a terrible century for Greece, because after 1922, you had the Second World War and the Italian and German occupations and lots of death there. And then you had a civil war and lots of death there. And then you had the post-civil situation, which was terrible. And then you had NATO. So all those things influenced that process of recognition. I deal with those matters in that study that will come out in autumn. It is a very, very complicated reality with endogenous and exogenous factors playing into that game.
Yes, it's very complicated, many dimensions, but it's also very simple.
Well, I think it's a time, I think the term catastrophe is a misnomer, because it could be, for people who don't know the history, they would think that this is a natural event that caused this. Okay, the term should be replaced by genocide, and that's the reason why, in other words, we have all these problems. Because after the defeat of the Greek army, the Greek government was trying to save whatever was left, whether it was in Greece or anywhere. So they just adopted this term catastrophe, and they forgot about all the deportations and massacres and everything else that preceded the defeat. That was all forgotten. As a result, the term genocide was not introduced until much later, like in the 80s, correct? So that's
we have two things. The one is the genocide process, or the genocide from 19 to 23, which was called catastrophe because back then, after 20s, there was no other term than that. And then we have a second process, a second event, was the catastrophe of the defeat of the Greek army, or so there are two things that partly coincide, but are also autonomous. So some people, when they speak of catastrophe, they mean the genocidal process, but call it catastrophe because that was the vocabulary used in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s before the term genocide was introduced by Lemkin. And then there are some people who call catastrophe the defeat of the Greek army, or the withdrawal of the Greek army from Asia Minor. So it is not always clear when people speak of catastrophe what they mean, because you have two things together.
But when we're trying to get an international recognition,
now we say genocide.
We cannot use the term catastrophe because people they say, "What is that? What do you mean catastrophe? You're talking about genocide, but then you're talking about catastrophe. Which one was it?"
Now, when we call when we speak of that genocidal process, we call it genocide. I mean,
Yeah.
now the term genocide is being applied very.
Do you have a Greek word for it? Because for Holocaust there is Shoah. For Armenians there is Medzi. Do the Greeks have a word?
We have been
that
using.
they use themselves to refer to it, that you can use to capture.
We have been using the terms Asia Minor catastrophe, then Great Catastrophe, Great Tragedy, Asia Minor tragedy, National tragedy, great suffering, and uprooting. All these terms have been used prior to the introduction of the term genocide and prior to the emergence of the consciousness that also the Greek destructional process was genocide.
Well, yeah, I mean, the lexicon has changed. The lexicon has changed. The words have changed. You know, from the 1940s and on. I mean, they've changed. So now we're going back to the word. We're going to the word, like everybody else.
Well,
even the Armenians began using the term genocide more or less after 1965.
Yes, yes.
But we do have a New York Times article from 1947 saying that if the United Nations adopt appropriate legislation, then the Tsarist pogroms and the massacres of Armenians and Greeks by Turks will be recognized as genocide.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So this is from 1947, and it was in New York Times then, and the author of that article is most likely Lemkin.
Yeah.
well, do you have a date for that, specific date, or what date?
Is the January of 1947, and it is before the adoption of the convention, and most likely the author is Lemkin.
Okay, Sam, some final thoughts. Some final thoughts for you for the evening. At least on this other side of the pond, as they say.
I think can I say my final thoughts?
Please, that's what we're asking.
I think there's probably documents about the Greek genocide in some of the major libraries in the United States that are waiting to be, I'm just speculating, to be uncovered and used to, come up with some additional research or publishing and shed more light on this particular genocide from other sources, from other aspects. So I think that's something that maybe our young Greeks who follow and who are interested in this may go ahead and look into that direction.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you to the panelists. This has been a fascinating discussion, which obviously has to be continued because we can't just let it sit. We have to continue discussing the issue as more things are discovered. As was mentioned before, more researchers do work, and we should constantly focus on this so we don't forget these issues. Thanks again to the audience.
I think
please.
it's also important to emphasize that it's amazing to look at from the vantage point of the Ottoman Empire to all minoritized people and see it as a whole, because the violence goes beyond only the Greeks and the Armenians. It's the orientation they have towards the governance. That's violence. And that still continues to this day.
It's important. It's important. Thank you again to everyone, and thank you for all.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Guys, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good morning to some, and good night to others, and good evening to.
It's 12 o'clock here.
It's 12 o'clock here in Athens.
Yeah, that's right. Take care, guys.